Rome did not collapse under the weight of a single invasion, a lone battle, or one dramatic moment of destruction. The true breaking point began much earlier, quietly, inside its own financial system. Long before the Western Empire fell in 476 CE, its money had already collapsed, its economic foundations had already cracked, and its internal weaknesses were already accelerating toward disaster. It doesn't start with barbarians at the gates. It starts with the gradual erosion of trust in Roman currency, the rise of crushing inflation, and the shrinking revenues that crippled Rome's ability to function as a world-spanning superpower. The Roman Empire's downfall is often taught as a military event, but its economic story is far more revealing. At its height, Rome controlled vast territories, unprecedented trade routes, precious metal mines, agricultural wealth, and a taxation system that pulled resources from nearly every known corner of the ancient world. The empire appeared unstoppable. But beneath the surface, the institutions that supported this prosperity began to fail. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy. Provincial governors extracted wealth for themselves instead of the state, and the financial pressures of a growing army pushed the government into desperate measures. Inflation soared as emperors repeatedly debased the silver denarius to pay soldiers and cover rising expenses. Each adulterated coin circulated as a reminder that the state could not meet its obligations honestly. Confidence in Roman money, once trusted from Britain to Syria, began to fade. Traders demanded payment in gold or goods, tax revenues weakened, and essential supplies became harder to source. The empire Auder-S economy slowly shifted from a monetized system to one dominated by barter and local survival. At the same time, the government's dependence on territorial expansion for revenue created a dangerous cycle. As conquests slowed, financial inflows declined. Yet expenses continued to rise. Frontier defenses, military wages, welfare distributions, and ambitious building projects all required constant funding. When the state could no longer balance its books, it resorted to harsher taxation, forced labor, and increasingly aggressive financial decrees that pushed ordinary citizens toward poverty or flight. How did Rome build the richest economy of the ancient world? Why did that financial system ultimately break down from within? What lessons does Rome's collapse hold for modern financial systems facing inflation, debt, and declining public trust? The Roman Empire operated one of the most complex, far-reaching, and resource-intensive economic systems in human history. At its height, Rome's financial engine stretched across 3 continents, pulling in wealth from an enormous network of provinces, trade corridors, and tributary states. Taxes flowed into imperial coffers in the form of grain, gold, silver, animals, textiles, and labor. Caravans carried goods from Arabia, Egypt, Gaul, and beyond, all feeding into Rome's markets. Ships crossed the Mediterranean packed with olive oil, spices, and raw materials that kept the empire's commercial lifeblood in motion. The entire system rested on a foundational promise that Rome could pay its soldiers, build its infrastructure, maintain its cities, and protect its borders. A significant portion of Rome's budget went directly to its military. Armies stationed along the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, and in North Africa demanded continuous funding. Soldiers required salaries, equipment, food, transport animals, fortifications, and replacements for losses in war or disease. For centuries, the state kept up with these expenses through consistent tax collection, war booty, and the extraordinary wealth extracted from newly conquered regions. Expansion was not only a military strategy, it was a financial necessity. However, the financial strength that once fueled Rome's dominance eventually transformed into a liability. When expansion slowed, revenues stagnated. When political instability increased, trade weakened. When corruption spread, tax income shrank. And when the state responded to these pressures through currency debasement and emergency levies, the economic strain reached every level of society. Understanding this process is crucial because it mirrors challenges seen in modern economies: dilution of currency value, reliance on debt, oversized military spending, and the consequences of losing public confidence in financial institutions. The financial system of the Roman Empire was built on several interconnected pillars that allowed it to expand from a small city-state to the dominant power of the ancient world. At its core, Rome relied on a steady flow of wealth from conquered territories. Provinces were required to pay taxes in multiple forms: agricultural produce, precious metals, livestock, or manufactured goods. The land tax and head tax formed the backbone of provincial revenue, ensuring that every household contributed to the empire's treasury. These taxes were collected by local officials or contractors and then transferred to the state. As Rome expanded, each newly absorbed region added another stream of income, allowing the empire's financial base to grow in step with its territory. Another significant source of early wealth came from war loot and the forced labor extracted from defeated peoples. Victorious campaigns brought back enormous quantities of gold, silver weapons, livestock, and artwork. Entire communities were taken as slaves, providing the state with both manpower and saleable property. Slavery became an essential component of Roman economic life. Enslaved individuals worked in mines, fields, workshops, construction sites, and households, freeing Roman citizens for military service or skilled occupations. Their labor increased agricultural output, supported massive building projects, and expanded industrial production, all of which fed into Rome's broader economic system. Agricultural production was another critical foundation of Roman wealth. Land ownership defined social status, political power, and financial influence. The estates of the elite produced grain, olive oil, wine, and livestock that supplied cities, armies, and export markets. Surplus production created stability and allowed taxes to be collected reliably. Because agriculture formed the economic base of the empire, any disruption to farming through war, disease, or climate shifts had direct financial consequences for the state. The Roman monetary system also played a central role in the empire's financial strength. Rome operated on precious metal coinage, not fiat money. The gold aureus, silver denarius, and bronze sestertius served as the universal mediums of exchange across vast distances. The intrinsic value of these coins created trust, facilitated trade, and ensured stability in transactions from Britain to Egypt. The purity of Roman silver and gold coinage was initially a key factor in building its economic reputation. Merchants, soldiers, and provincial communities accepted Roman currency because it represented real value backed by metal content, not government decree. These foundational elements, taxes, war revenues, agricultural output, slave labor, and precious metal money, created the economic engine that powered Rome's rise. But they also shaped the vulnerabilities that later contributed to its decline. Rome's financial strength depended on a diverse set of revenue streams, each connected to the empire's vast geography and military expansion. The most important income sources were provincial taxes, which supplied the majority of Rome's annual revenue. These taxes were divided into two major categories: the land tax and the head tax. The land tax, assessed on agricultural estates, orchards, vineyards, and pastures, created a consistent and measurable source of income tied directly to the productivity of provincial farmland. The head tax required every adult in the provinces to pay a fixed amount, ensuring that even the poorest communities contributed to the imperial treasury. Together, these taxes allowed Rome to maintain a steady financial base as long as provincial populations remained stable and farmland remained productive. Customs duties added another layer of income. Goods that crossed provincial borders or entered Roman ports were taxed at rates that varied by region. These duties applied to a wide range of items, including textiles, metalwork, spices, livestock, and raw materials. Because the Roman Empire controlled major trade routes in the Mediterranean, the Near East, and parts of Europe, customs duties became an efficient way to generate revenue without directly burdening citizens. Merchants absorbed these costs and passed them along through market prices. The empire profited from the movement of goods across its internal and external borders. State monopolies also played a critical role in shaping Roman finances. Certain resources, especially salt and mining operations, were controlled directly by the government. Salt was indispensable for food preservation, animal husbandry, and daily life, making it a reliable and unavoidable revenue source. Mining, particularly of gold, silver, and copper, provided the raw materials for Roman coinage and contributed directly to the state's wealth. By restricting private control over these sectors, Rome ensured that strategic commodities remained under imperial supervision. One of the most significant and often overlooked sources of revenue was tribute from conquered regions. Newly subjugated territories were required to pay large one-time sums and ongoing obligations in gold, grain, livestock, textiles, and slaves. These tribute payments fueled Rome's rapid expansion and financed public works, military campaigns, festivals, and the growing bureaucracy. For centuries, the empire operated with a financial model that depended heavily on constant territorial additions. As long as new conquests continued, fresh revenue kept flowing. This system created a structural risk. The moment expansion stalled, financial pressure intensified. In many ways, the model functioned like a massive state-run scheme that required continuous new inputs to sustain its obligations. Rome's revenue system worked brilliantly during periods of expansion, but it carried within it the seeds of long-term instability. The Roman Empire's financial challenges were closely linked to the way it spent its wealth. The largest and most demanding expense was the military. At its peak, Rome maintained hundreds of thousands of soldiers stationed across enormous frontiers. These troops required regular salaries, bonuses, pensions, weapons, armor, horses, rations, and transport infrastructure. Military pay alone consumed a massive share of the annual budget. And every emperor understood that failing to compensate soldiers on time could spark mutiny, civil war, or political overthrow. As external threats grew and border regions became less secure, the number of troops increased, placing even greater strain on state finances. Beyond the military, Rome invested heavily in public works. Roads connected distant provinces, allowing armies to move quickly and goods to travel efficiently. Aqueducts supplied cities with clean water, supporting population growth and public health. Bathhouses, theaters, temples, and amphitheaters reinforced Roman cultural identity and projected imperial power. These projects demanded enormous amounts of labor, materials, and specialized engineering expertise. While such investments strengthened Rome's influence, they also required ongoing maintenance costs that accumulated over generations. Welfare programs were another major source of expenditure. The grain dole, known as the annona, provided free or subsidized grain to hundreds of thousands of citizens in Rome and other major cities. This policy stabilized urban populations and prevented unrest, but it required vast shipments of grain from North Africa, Egypt, and Sicily. Additional subsidies included oil distributions, public entertainment, and occasional cash payments designed to win political support. Over time, welfare spending expanded as economic pressures increased, turning it into a permanent and burdensome state obligation. Lavish court expenses further strained the treasury. Emperors and elites spent heavily on palace complexes, ceremonial events, elite guards, and extravagant displays of wealth. Some emperors redirected public funds toward personal luxuries or patronage networks, rewarding loyalists with estates, titles, and financial privileges. Corruption spread through provincial administrations and tax collection systems, reducing the amount of revenue that actually reached the state. Finally, the bureaucracy grew significantly as the empire matured. Administrators, clerks, tax collectors, legal officials, and provincial governors required salaries and oversight. And what began as a relatively lean system expanded into a huge administrative machine. As governmental functions multiplied, the costs of managing the empire rose, prompting frequent tax increases that strained provincial populations. These combined expenses, military obligations, infrastructure, welfare, court extravagance, corruption, and bureaucratic expansion, created a financial structure that became increasingly difficult to sustain as revenues declined. The collapse of Rome's monetary system can be traced through the gradual but relentless debasement of its most important coin, the silver denarius. When first introduced, the denarius contained roughly 98% pure silver and became one of the most trusted currencies in the ancient world. Its consistent metal content made it reliable for long-distance trade, military pay, and tax collection. For generations, the stability of Roman coinage supported the smooth functioning of the empire's vast economy. However, as military costs and administrative burdens increased, emperors began reducing the silver content of the denarius to stretch the supply of precious metal. Each reduction allowed the government to mint more coins without securing additional silver. Early debasements were subtle, but over time, the purity of the coin dropped dramatically. By the 2nd century CE, the silver content had already begun to fall. By the mid-3rd century, coins that once carried real value contained only traces of silver, sometimes as low as 2 to 5%. What remained was mostly bronze, coated with a thin silver wash that quickly wore off in circulation. This process functioned as an ancient form of money printing. The state produced more currency without increasing the underlying metal reserves, causing inflation to rise across the empire. As soldiers were paid with increasingly worthless coins, the government had to raise salaries repeatedly to maintain loyalty. Larger quantities of increasingly debased money circulated in the economy, fueling rapid price increases. The 3rd century witnessed a period of severe hyperinflation, during which the purchasing power of Roman currency collapsed. Prices for basic goods soared, savings lost value, and economic planning became nearly impossible. The erosion of trust was immediate and profound. People recognized that the coins in their hands no longer represented the same value as before. Merchants began refusing denarii in everyday transactions and demanded payment in gold coins, such as the aureus, or in goods like grain, livestock, or cloth. Bartering increased as formal currency lost credibility. Provinces began hoarding higher quality older coins or foreign currency, creating regional disparities in economic stability. The loss of monetary integrity damaged every part of the imperial system. Tax collection became difficult because taxpayers resisted accepting payment schedules based on worthless currency. Soldiers and officials demanded gold or tangible goods instead of debased coins. As trust evaporated, trade slowed, markets contracted, and the empire's ability to fund its own operations deteriorated. Currency debasement turned a once stable system into a financial crisis that accelerated Rome's decline and exposed deep weaknesses in its economic foundations. As Rome's revenues declined and expenses continued to rise, the empire turned increasingly toward aggressive taxation to fill the widening financial gap. What began as a structured and predictable system gradually evolved into a burdensome and often punitive apparatus. The government demanded higher payments from provinces, cities, landowners, and small farmers. Annual tax rates increased, special levies were introduced, and assessments became more frequent. Instead of stabilizing the empire, These measures pushed many communities into deeper economic distress. Tax collectors held enormous power during this period. Many of them took advantage of their positions, inflating assessments, demanding bribes, or seizing property when people could not meet the new requirements. Local elites were often held personally responsible for the tax quotas of their entire districts, forcing them to pressure lower-class households to pay even when conditions were dire. This environment of coercion and exploitation weakened the relationship between citizens and the state, fostering resentment and resistance. The idea of Roman rule bringing prosperity and stability faded as taxation became synonymous with hardship. For rural populations, the burden became unbearable. Farmers were expected to deliver grain, livestock, and cash even when harvests were poor or markets unstable. Many small landowners reached a breaking point. Instead of remaining tied to their farms and facing endless tax increases, they walked away from their land entirely. Abandoned fields spread across the empire, reducing agricultural output and intensifying the state's financial problems. With fewer farmers producing surplus, the tax base shrank further, forcing the government to impose even higher demands on those who remained. One of the most significant long-term consequences of this crisis was the emergence of early forms of serfdom. As taxation pressures mounted, many small farmers sought protection from wealthy landowners. These landowners offered security, food, and stable obligations, but in return, farmers surrendered much of their independence and accepted permanent ties to the estates they worked on. Over time, this arrangement hardened into a semi-bonded status that laid the foundation for medieval serfdom. What began as a response to financial desperation ultimately reshaped the social and economic structure of Europe. The taxation crisis marked a turning point in the empire's decline. Instead of supporting growth, the tax system accelerated economic collapse, eroded trust in government, depopulated rural regions, and contributed to transformations that would define the post-Roman world. As the state squeezed its citizens ever harder, the financial lifeblood of the empire drained away. The economic strength of the Roman Empire depended heavily on reliable trade routes, thriving cities, and a steady labor force. When these pillars weakened, the entire system began to fracture. Political instability played a central role in disrupting long-distance commerce. Civil wars, competing emperors, and frequent military rebellions created regions where authority was unclear or contested. Armies marched across provinces, seizing supplies, damaging infrastructure, and making major trade roads unsafe. Merchants who once traveled freely between Gaul, Italy, North Africa, and the Near East faced growing risks of theft, extortion, or violence. As insecurity spread, the predictable flow of goods slowed dramatically. Cities, which had long served as the commercial and administrative heart of the empire, also began to decline. Economic strain, falling tax revenues, and weakened local governance left urban centers unable to maintain markets, public spaces, or essential services. Shops closed, craftsmen relocated, and once bustling streets became quiet. With trade shrinking and public works deteriorating, many cities lost population, reducing their ability to support economic activity. This contraction weakened the interconnected network of urban economies that had powered Roman wealth for centuries. Labor shortages intensified the downturn. Repeated waves of plague, including the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century and the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd, killed millions across the empire. These losses created severe shortages of farmers, artisans, miners, and soldiers. Agricultural production suffered as estates lacked the manpower to sow or harvest. Workshops and factories struggled to maintain output. Mines that had once supplied the raw materials for coinage and industry saw reduced labor force participation, further diminishing state revenues. As productivity fell, the state faced growing difficulty supplying grain, weapons, and essential goods to its armies and cities. Long-distance commerce, once the backbone of the imperial economy, broke down under the combined pressure of insecurity, declining cities, and reduced labor capacity. Trade routes to India, Arabia, and East Africa weakened as Rome's ability to protect merchants diminished. Internal commerce also suffered as provinces grew more isolated. Regions that once specialized in particular goods could no longer rely on the network that transferred products across the empire. Economic self-sufficiency became a necessity rather than a choice, leading to a more localized, less dynamic economy. The collapse of trade and productivity did not happen overnight, but its effects accumulated. As each part of the economic system faltered, transport, markets, cities, labor, Rome's financial foundation eroded. The empire's once unified economy fragmented, contributing significantly to its eventual collapse. When Rome's financial system reached a breaking point in the late 3rd century, Emperor Diocletian attempted one of the most ambitious economic overhauls in ancient history. His goal was to restore confidence in the currency, control runaway prices, and stabilize the tax base that had been steadily shrinking for decades. The reforms addressed the empire's deepest structural weaknesses, but the results were mixed, and many measures created new economic pressures. One of Diocletian's first major actions was a complete overhaul of the coinage system. By the time he took power, Roman money had lost nearly all its intrinsic value. Diocletian introduced new coins with improved silver content and attempted to re-establish a stable monetary hierarchy composed of gold, silver, and copper denominations. The reformed aureus, argenteus, and various bronze coins were designed to restore public trust and revive long-distance trade. While these new coins were purer than the severely debased currency of previous decades, the government continued producing large quantities to meet rising expenditures. As a result, the long-term effect on stability was limited. To combat inflation, Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 CE, one of the most extensive price control efforts in history. The edict listed maximum prices for thousands of goods and services, from grain and livestock to clothing, transport, and labor. The intention was to protect consumers from soaring inflation and prevent profiteering by merchants. However, the edict proved unenforceable across the empire's vast territory. Prices varied naturally by region, and local officials lacked the capacity to supervise every market. Many merchants stopped selling goods rather than risk punishment for violating price limits. In some areas, the edict triggered shortages and encouraged black markets, ultimately undermining the stability it was meant to secure. Another major reform targeted the empire's shrinking labor force and unstable tax base. Diocletian attempted to lock individuals into their professions and tie farmers permanently to their land. This policy aimed to guarantee predictable tax revenues and ensure that essential economic roles, such as farming, baking, and military supply, remained filled. Over time, these measures contributed to the development of a rigid, hereditary economic structure. Farmers, craftspeople, and even tax collectors were legally obligated to continue in the same occupations, reducing social mobility but increasing administrative control. Diocletian's reforms demonstrated the scale of Rome's crisis. They reflected a government attempting to manage collapse through centralization and strict regulation. Although some stability returned temporarily, the underlying economic weaknesses remained, setting the stage for further decline in the centuries ahead. In the early 4th century, Emperor Constantine introduced a major reform to stabilize Rome's faltering economy through the creation of a new gold standard. The centerpiece of this initiative was the solidus, a high-purity gold coin intended to restore trust in Roman currency. Unlike the severely debased silver and bronze coins circulating at the time, the solidus maintained consistent weight and quality, making it highly reliable for both domestic and international transactions. Its introduction marked a critical attempt to address the ongoing problems of inflation and currency instability that had plagued the empire for decades. The solidus proved effective in certain respects. Its intrinsic value allowed the government to conduct large-scale transactions with confidence, especially in paying soldiers, funding the bureaucracy, and managing long-distance trade. Merchants and provincial administrators quickly recognized the coin's reliability, and it became the preferred medium for high-value contracts. In addition, the solidus helped re-establish a stable reference for the empire's accounting system, which had been thrown into disarray by decades of debased silver currency. For the elite, the military, and government institutions, this gold standard provided a temporary financial anchor, allowing the state to operate with a degree of fiscal order that had been absent in the previous century. However, the benefits of the solidus were largely confined to the upper levels of Roman society. Ordinary citizens, small farmers, artisans, and laborers rarely handled gold coins, as most daily transactions still relied on bronze or low-value silver coins, which continued to suffer from debasement. Inflation and rising prices persisted in local markets, and wages for the general population often lagged behind the cost of living. As a result, the economic pressures on the majority of people did not diminish, and social inequality remained stark. While the gold standard provided stability for the state and elite classes, it did little to alleviate the financial hardships faced by the wider population. The introduction of the solidus illustrates a central theme in Rome's economic history: temporary solutions that addressed symptoms without resolving underlying structural problems. It strengthened confidence in government finances and long-distance trade, but could not correct the systemic issues of overspending, over-reliance on taxation, and declining productivity. Ultimately, while Constantine's gold standard delayed financial collapse, it did not prevent the long-term vulnerabilities that would continue to undermine the empire in both the western and eastern territories. The financial collapse of the Roman Empire reached its critical stage in the 5th century, particularly in the Western Empire. By this time, the state faced a severe decline in tax revenue, leaving it unable to sustain the essential functions of government. One of the most significant blows came with the loss of North Africa, a region that had been the empire's primary source of grain and a vital contributor to tax income. Without these resources, Rome could no longer supply its cities, fund the army, or maintain the infrastructure that connected its provinces. The empire's economic lifeline had been severed, and the consequences were immediate and profound. As revenue streams dried up, the Western Empire struggled to pay its soldiers and bureaucrats. Military units stationed along the Rhine, Danube, and other vulnerable frontiers went unpaid, leading to desertions, mutinies, and weakened defenses. The administrative machinery of the state began to fail as officials could no longer be compensated, and local governance deteriorated. Public works fell into disrepair, law enforcement weakened, and the ability to collect taxes effectively declined further, creating a vicious cycle of financial and political decline. The collapse of the monetary system compounded these challenges. Decades of currency debasement, inflation, and reliance on unstable revenue streams had already eroded trust in coinage. By the final stages of the Western Empire, money was scarce, commerce had slowed dramatically, and bartering had become common in place of formal currency. Without a functioning financial system, the government could not organize large-scale operations, maintain its bureaucracy, or mobilize armies effectively. Political authority weakened as economic control slipped from central hands to local powers and invading groups. In contrast, the Eastern Empire, later known as Byzantium, managed to survive and maintain relative stability. Its economic base was stronger, with access to gold reserves, more reliable tax collection, and a network of cities that remained productive. And while the East faced its own challenges, the presence of a stable currency and a diversified revenue system allowed it to continue funding the military, bureaucracy, and essential services. The survival of the Eastern Empire highlights the central role of financial management in sustaining political power. Where Rome's fiscal system in the West failed, political collapse followed almost inevitably. Where the East preserved its economic foundation, the state endured for centuries. The final breakdown of the Western Empire demonstrates that financial collapse was not a side effect of Rome's decline. It was a central cause. The loss of revenue, the inability to pay armies, the failure of currency, and the erosion of administrative capacity together ensured that Rome could no longer function as a unified political entity. Economics determined the fate of the empire as decisively as any military defeat. The collapse of the Roman financial system was the result of a combination of structural weaknesses, policy failures, and external pressures that accumulated over centuries. One of the most fundamental issues was the empire's over-reliance on revenue from conquest. For generations, Rome expanded its territory to secure new taxes, tribute, and resources from newly subdued peoples. While this strategy initially provided extraordinary wealth, it created a dependency on continual expansion. When conquest slowed in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, revenue streams diminished. Without fresh provinces to exploit, the empire struggled to sustain its complex bureaucracy, military, and public services. Currency debasement further undermined the financial system. To meet escalating expenditures, emperors repeatedly reduced the silver content of the denarius, turning previously reliable money into nearly worthless coins. Hyperinflation followed, eroding public confidence in Roman currency. Merchants, soldiers, and provincial communities increasingly demanded payment in gold or goods, while bartering became common. The loss of trust in money crippled both trade and tax collection, weakening the state's ability to finance its operations and maintain the economic cohesion that had supported Rome for centuries. Military costs became unmanageable as well. The empire required vast armies to defend its borders, suppress internal rebellions, and secure trade routes. Soldiers demanded salaries, pensions, and provisions, and their numbers rose in response to growing threats from external invaders and civil wars. The financial strain of sustaining such a large and dispersed military force exceeded the state's capacity, forcing higher taxes, additional debasement, and desperate financial measures that only exacerbated the crisis. The tax burden placed on citizens and provinces also played a central role in the collapse. As revenues fell and expenses rose, taxation increased sharply. Harsh assessments, exploitation by local collectors, and repeated levies pushed farmers, artisans, and merchants to abandon land, flee regions, or enter semi-bonded labor arrangements. Economic activity slowed, agricultural output declined, and trade diminished. Rather than supporting the state, the tax system became a driver of economic contraction, creating a downward spiral of diminishing returns. Ultimately, the Roman financial system could not adapt to a transition from expansion to stability. It had been designed to function in a context of continuous territorial growth, conquest, and loot. Once expansion ceased and internal pressures mounted, the system lacked the flexibility to maintain sustainable revenues, stabilize currency, or support social and economic structures effectively. Without reform strong enough to address these deep structural flaws, financial collapse became inevitable, laying the groundwork for the political and military disintegration of the Western Empire.